I guess I was fairly apprehensive the whole time that I was flying in combat. And I guess there's good reason to feel that way. I'm there to cause a lot of damage and a lot of harm, and therefore they would like to damage me. And I was 25 years old at that time.
The Navy's first ace was Naval Aviator number 85, David Ingalls, in 1918. Flying a British Sopwith Camel for the RAF, he shot down 5 German airplanes in 6 weeks. Plane design and production proceeded unstopped for the next 20 years, and by World War II, naval aviation had become a power to defend our way of life, particularly in the Pacific Theater, after the surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. Just 4 months later, in April 1942, Jimmy Doolittle led 16 Army Air Corps B-25 bombers from the Navy carrier Hornet in a daring raid. They accurately and successfully bombed targets in Japan that sent a strong message to the Japanese leadership. The message: you made a huge mistake bombing America. Navy planes dominated in the Pacific War. Fighters, the Grumman Cat series, the Wildcat, the Bearcat, the Tiger Cat, and the Hellcat. Hellcat pilots shot down over 5,000 Japanese airplanes in the Pacific. And the Helldiver that replaced the Dauntless. There were PBYs and the Kingfisher spotter and rescue planes, and of course, the 400-mile-per-hour Corsair. The Corsair was one of the most successful fighter planes of World War II, and very effective later in the Korean War. Most of its fighting in World War II was in the Pacific Theater against the Japanese. The Navy flew the Corsair from aircraft carriers, the Marines from island airfields. It was an air-to-air fighter, it was a ground attack aircraft, and escorted on bomber missions, protecting them from Japanese fighters. The Japanese called it whistling death because of a distinctive sound the Corsair made at high speeds.
Today, we have a Corsair sponsored by Jumbo Lair Aviation Community and owned and operated by the American Honor Foundation. It is newly painted in honor of U.S. Naval Aviator Charles Joseph Obi O'Brien. Growing up building models, hanging out the airport, and devouring aviation books and magazines, Obi took to the skies at 9 years of age in a Ford Trimotor in 1937. Flying was in his blood. In 1946, while Obie graduated from prep school, the Navy started a new program for potential pilots, known as the Naval Aviation College Program. Passing all the necessary exams, he was eligible to attend a college with a Naval ROTC program. He enrolled in Villanova College and was also sworn into the Navy on July 18, 1946, as a V-5 apprentice seaman. After spending the required 2 years in college, Obie reported to Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida, where he trained in the SNJ and Hellcat. He earned his gold wings in June of 1950. Upon graduation, he reported for duty with Jet Training Unit 1 at Whiting Field, where he logged time in the Lockheed TO-1, the Navy's designation for the F-80C Shooting Star. Completing his jet training, Obie was assigned to a Corsair unit. As he says, go figure. Obie has over 7,000 flight hours in 52 types of aircraft and 735 arrested landings on 20 different carriers. He also held the honor of being the only pilot in the world actively flying the Corsair, like he flew in combat until he retired in 2013 at the young age of 85.
359 was my airplane. It had my name on it, and I liked it. Of course, I flew it 3 times in combat. It's been well taken care of. It's had 6 or 7 owners in the last 60 years, and it's just like a brand new airplane. When I got in it, a lot of nostalgia. Some of the instruments I didn't recognize because when I flew it, it was pretty basic. But the airplane smelled just the same. I certainly appreciate the past owner and the present owners taking care of my airplane.
Good morning, folks. Welcome to Warbirds of America 2020/21. We missed last year. We're going to have our pilot presentators here, 3 of them. I'm going to introduce you to them very shortly. We're going to have the video, fairly long video with Obie, and then we'll talk about the particular airplanes, and then if we have time, we're going to have a question and answer. So to start off, we have Charlie Lynch. Charlie, would you raise your hand there? And Charlie, he works in private aviation. He's qualified in numerous aircraft, including the Zero, the P-51, the Spit, the Corsair, these airplanes here. Then we have Mark Murphy. Mark's in the center here. Mark is a professional warbird instructor in the TBM, the P-51, the B-25, the T-28, the L-39, the Corsair, the DC-3, the Jap Zero, the P-40s, the Hellcat, Spitfire, and other airplanes. He's got 7,500 hours of flying time, and you've been flying Warbirds since when?
Since about 2005.
So when you were 5 years old.
Exactly.
Okay.
52 years old.
Yeah. Now we have Zach McNeil on my left here. Now Zach is a retired Navy, 20 years pilot for a major airline. He flies now for a major airline. He's an EA examiner inspector specializing in heavy helicopters and fighter training. He's a designated flight examiner, and he lists there's too many airplanes for even try, so we won't list them. Now, Zach, will you tell us a little bit about your foundation, and also at your end of it, would you go ahead and present our Obi O'Brien video, please?
Yeah, thanks. The foundation's name is American Honor Foundation. We started it last year, and you can tell we're rapidly growing our collection. The idea is to identify a type of warbird and a specific pilot that we'd like to honor that has done something that we think is neat or cool as a group. We started with a P-51. We got another P-51. We got the Corsair. We have the F-86. We have an L-39 and a T-6, and we're still working on building our collection. As you can see, we'll talk a little bit later about the pilot the F-86 named after, and we're going to concentrate on the pilot Obie with the Corsair today. I want to mention, if you don't mind, the sponsor that let us come up here.
Please do.
Jumble Air. Anybody, raise your hand if you ever heard of Jumble Air. It's got a really eclectic past. It was recently purchased by our main sponsor for the foundation. It's been a zoo for elephants. It has a really unique. It's the longest privately owned runway in the United States, and one of the biggest tenants there is John Travolta. The current owner is redeveloping it. It's going to build some aviation estates there, and part of the our marketing campaign is to bring all these beautiful aircraft here and let everybody know about it. So if you're thinking about buying a nice estate down in Florida, in the Ocala area, please come talk to us. We'd love to have you and help support the Warbird community. And finally, I had a few notes and facts to introduce Obie, but it was so brilliantly covered in the intro there. The one thing I do want to mention about Obie was he was on 3 different ships, USS Coral Sea, USS Lake Champlain, and the USS Boxer. He had 70 hours combat time and 22 hours of combat sorties. And I want to point out the obvious. It's very rare to actually have a combat veteran warbird because of how the aircraft, people didn't want to buy the ones with bullet holes. They bought the ones that were just coming off the assembly line. So we have an actual aircraft here. Afterwards, I'll be standing. We have the actual chart that Obie used in the Korean War to fight with this aircraft. Of course, it won't leave my hands, but if anybody would like to see it, I'll show it to you later today, and we'll have some pictures up on Warbirds in Review. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our interview with Obie. So pay attention to the Jumbotron.
Ever since I was a little toddler, about 5 years old, I was interested in airplanes. We were vacationing in Ocean City, New Jersey. Fortunately, there was an airport very close to us. And I would go down there on my bike and hang around and talk to the people. And I saw a sign that says there's going to be a tri-motor Ford airplane here next week. And you can get a ride on one. So I thought that was a good idea. And the price for me would be $2.50. $2.50. I was only 9 years old. This is 1937. $2.50. I was a paper boy, and I got a penny of paper, so that was 250 papers I had to deliver to get that ride. So I went down there, and I got onto the airplane. We had about a 15-minute ride, and I came back. I had not asked my parents whether it was okay or not, because I figured that permission would be very hard, impossible to get, and forgiveness might be a little bit easier. So I took my ride, and then when I came home, I told my mother what I had done, and she was very, very unhappy. And I told her how sorry I was, but I got a good ride. My father just kind of smiled. That was the last ride I had until I joined the Navy and started Navy flight training. But that cemented my desire to fly. There's no doubt that what I was going to do later in life. I graduated from high school in 1946. In 1946, everybody in the Navy was, all the pilots, everybody was getting out and going back to school. The Navy saw that there would be a valley of lack of pilots during those years, and so they started a one-year program, which would, if you could qualify, get yourself into an NROTC college, pass all the aviation, the physical and the mental, pass the interviews, they would let you enlist as an apprentice seaman, send you to school for 2 years. I went to Villanova, by the way, for 2 years, $50 a month on books and tuition. And then following that, you would go to Pensacola, be sworn in as a midshipman, and go through flight training. I went to Pensacola in 1948, took basic flight training in the SNJ, qualified on the carrier in the SNJ, went down to Corpus Christi for advanced training, flew the Hellcat, the S6F, went through that training, qualified on the carrier in the S6F, and got my wings in June of 1950. In 1950, I was assigned to take jet training. The Navy had some F-80s, we called them TO-1s, single-seat jet. And it was only a month course, 25 hours, and I went through that and enjoyed flying a jet. It was a new experience for me after flying the SNJ and the S6. My first flight, I had never been in a tricycle landing gear. I had never been in any kind of a jet, even a commercial jet. And so it was quite a thrill to sit there, be able to see the runway clearly, and add the power and take off. It was quite a thrill. After completing the jet training, I went to talk to my detailer, and he said the Korean War had started, and they were starting a couple of squadrons down in Jacksonville, Florida. It was 4 Corsair squadrons, and they needed pilots. So guess where I was going? I was going to Jacksonville and fly Corsairs, which I had mixed feelings about. I would like to fly the Corsair, but I also would have liked to flown jets. But in the end, I think the best thing that ever happened to me really was to be assigned to Corsairs. I made 2 med cruises in the Corsair, flying the F4U-5, the first cruise, the F4U-4, the second cruise, and then we went to Korea flying the F4U-4. The skipper called us into an all-pilots meeting and said, guess where we're going, guys? Because everybody really was anxious to do our share. The West Coast pilots were flying, and we were going in the med. We thought maybe we should be doing our share of the fighting. So we left Mayport, Florida on the Lake Champlain, which is a Essex-type carrier, straight deck, of course, and went through the Med, through the Suez, and into Korea. We flew a line period from the Lake Champlain and cross-decked over to the USS Boxer, and they sent a jet squadron over to the Lake Champlain. It had something to do with the fuel capacity of the ships. On my first launch, we briefed in the ready room for a strike on a bridge. The bomb load was going to be a 1,000-pound bomb and 250 bombs and six loaded 50 caliber machine guns. We briefed very carefully the launch of four Corsairs. I was number 4. Went out to the airplane. At that time, I remember being a 25-year-old bachelor, hot to trot, ready to go out and break something. Really. So when I got in the airplane, you would taxi up to the deck launch officer. He would give you the wind-up signal after you gave him a thumbs up that your instruments were okay. You would add as much power as you could until you felt the tail just getting very light. When he gave you the signal to go, you would add full power, and that big 13-foot prop, a lot of torque, so you needed a lot of right rudder. And went off the deck. The ship would be making some of its own wind, at least 32, maybe 35 knots. You were too heavy for the natural wind in the ships. They would download you a little bit, but that didn't happen very often. In any case, when you went off the end of the deck, you would settle just a little bit. You would get your wheels up as fast as you could, get a little bit of speed, raise those flaps gently, and turn off. The flight that we had was on a bridge in North Korea, and it was heavily defended on both ends. I think there was also railroad tracks on it. We climbed up to 8,000 feet, saw the target, and we made individual runs. The leader went down, number 2, number 3, and number 4, which was me. By the time I got started in my run, there was a pretty heavy anti-aircraft fire. And I thought, oh boy. And coming down, I could see these orange, they look like tennis balls coming up at me. And I thought, and I could hear them as they went by the airplane go, woof, woof. And then I thought to myself, I'm seeing only about a sixth of the ammunition being placed. But anyway, we would drop our bombs at about 3,000, the big bomb about 3,000 feet, and then we made 2 more passes to get rid of the other 2 bombs. And with each pass, it seemed like those tennis balls, those red tennis balls I call them, were getting closer and closer and more. In any case, when I got back to the ship, nobody was hit. It was a good flight, and we did significant damage to the bridge. We came back, came around, we all got aboard safely, and when I got out, then I got scared. I was not scared I was concerned, but I wasn't scared until I got back in the ready room and said, oh boy, that was hairy. We flew both, I think of the 24 missions, I flew 11 close air supports missions. The rest were strikes. And when we couldn't do a strike, we would be set free to do what we called road recce. And anything in North Korea was moving, wheeled, we would shoot at.
Okay.
On one occasion, I got 2 boxcars, which was good.
Okay. Did you always fly number 4, or did you move up to an element lead
No.
or flight lead?
I was mostly number 4. I was only an ensign.
And you were one of the young guys in the squadron.
I was one of the young guys in the squadron. And we flew in sections, the leader and his wingman, and then the section leader, which was the last 2 airplanes. And that would be a more senior officer than an ensign or a JG. But that was my spot, which I liked. And I would try to, when we were making a run, I would kind of get off to the side a little bit or come in at a slightly different angle, because I knew that they had war-sighted those first 3 airplanes, and I wanted to not be in the same flight path. The missions that I liked more than the strikes were close air support. And the way that worked is after you would launch from the ship, they would shift you to a unit called Red Crown, which coordinated all the close air support missions. If somebody needed close air support, they would go to Red Crown, and then they would assign you a mission. I liked those missions because we could get down low. We knew that we were helping our troops. And that was very rewarding, and it was especially rewarding when you got a message from the ground that, attaboy, and that was really good. We were controlled a lot of the times by an Air Force Mosquito, SNJ, and he would mark a target for us, and he would tell us what the results of our mission were. And I enjoyed that because I felt I was really doing something to help people. And when I got an attaboy, that made me feel great. They would mark the target sometimes. Okay, I'm going to put out a red rocket. And that's the target. Your target is so many feet from that. Okay, I see the red smoke, but then I look around and I see red smoke, red smoke, red smoke. Those rascals were listening to us, and it was clever. They had those things said. I guess they could do it by remote control, but it would, if you didn't know where the original smoke was and you just came in, you wouldn't know what you were supposed to do. Yeah, I was flying missions, and when the war was over, instead of bombing, we would go out and fly our mission on the last day. Instead of going down, getting low and dropping the bomb, we did what I call dip bombing. It would fly along, drop the nose a little bit, drop your bombs, and get out of there. Nobody wanted to be the last one shot down. 359 was my airplane. It had my name on it, and I liked it. Of course, I flew it down in Jacksonville, and I flew it 3 times in combat. It was a good airplane. I liked it very much. And on the way home from Korea, came back through the Med, and the Navy told us to drop off 2 of our Corsairs in Port Leahy. I volunteered, since my airplane was going to be one of the put in the pool status. I volunteered to take it to Port Leahy, and I flew it over there, and with the other guy, and we parked the airplanes, and we were brought immediately back to the ship as soon as we transferred the airplanes. That was the last time I saw that airplane until a couple of years ago. I found that airplane was still flying, and it was in California. Okay, after we got back to Jacksonville with VF-44, we traded in our Corsairs for Banshees, the McDonnell twin-engine jet. So I finally got to jets. A little bit late, but I got to them. I flew them for the next 10 months when I got orders to Pensacola to be an instructor. I was an instructor in Pensacola flying the SNJ, and from there I went to a photo reconnaissance school, and came back to Jacksonville in the Photo Crusader. The Photo Crusader was just like the fighter, except it didn't have any armament. It didn't have any guns. It was unarmed. Every carrier had 3 of those Crusaders on it. We did the same thing that the satellites do now. I made 3 cruisers in the Crusader, and our squadron motto was alone, because we flew alone. We were unarmed, because we were unarmed, and we were unafraid. And I always figured 2 out of 3 is not too bad. After leaving the Crusaders, which was a fine airplane, it was the 2nd best airplane I've ever flown. The Corsair was the best, and the Crusader was 2nd best. I got orders to New York recruit aviation orientated officers. That would be the AOC, the crewmen, and the pilots. I did that for 15 months, went to the postgraduate school, finally got my degree, and then went to the USS Bonhomme Richard as the assistant air officer. The assistant air officer is the air officer in charge of all aircraft movements within about 3 miles of the ship and everything on the deck. I spent 15 months there, and then came back to Norfolk. And here I was assigned to a staff, Commander Fleet Air Norfolk, which had air stations and all the fleet airplanes aboard. I was operations officer there. And then I got orders to be 7th Fleet representative, 7th Fleet liaison in Saigon to everybody in Saigon. It was like the go-to guy for carrier questions. I spent 14 months there. I came back to Norfolk and finished out my tours as operations officer of Naval Air Station Norfolk. Meantime, I got attached. I found out there was a group in New York called the Sky Typers. They were flying SNJs, 5 SNJs, 10,000 feet. Center one had a fly line abreast. The center one had a computer in it which triggers smoke on all 5 airplanes, which let a dot matrix message across the sky. And that was a lot of fun. I flew with them for 24 years, 24 air show seasons. the fighter factory over in Suffolk had some nice airplanes, and they were going to build a museum is where we are. And they had the Corsair, they had a TBM, and they had a Sky Raider and a lot of other airplanes, the Mosquito. And so I wrote a very nice letter and told the Sky Typers I found a better deal, so I was going to fly with them. To get into flying the museum, I had plenty of flight time. I had heavy time, and they were looking for a couple pilots, particularly S&J pilot. So I started flying the fighter factory's S&J, and then they got the Corsair, and since I had a lot of Corsair time, I got checked out in the Corsair, and since I was checked out in the Corsair, I thought maybe I should check out in their TBM, and when I checked out in the TBM, I thought maybe I ought to check out in the AD, and I did, plus all the other airplanes. And then they built the Military Aviation Museum here in Virginia Beach, and we moved from Suffolk, from the fighter factory, moved everything over here. The surprise that you had for me was that my Corsair 412 359 was flying in California, belonged to a gentleman out there. And my friend Steve contacted him, and he said if he's qualified in a Corsair, he's more than welcome to come fly his old mount. And over the course of 2 years, there was delayed, and finally we set a date, and we went out to California, to Ramona, near San Diego, and I was fortunate enough to fly my old Corsair that I had left in Port Leote 59 years ago. The last time I saw the airplane in Port Leote, it had been well worn. It was tired. It had been at sea for 8 months, combat in three or 4 months, and it was needed a paint job. When I saw it in Ramona, they opened the hangar doors, and I saw a beautiful plane, just like it was off the line. It was shiny, it was painted up very nice. It had Jesse Brown's name on one side. He was shot down in Korea. And on the other side was Hudner's name. Tom Hudner was a pilot who landed next to Jesse Brown in an unsuccessful effort to save him. Hudner was later on presented with the Congressional Medal of Honor for that action. Unfortunately, Jesse Brown was not recovered. No, I thought about the people who had flown that airplane. In addition to myself, they were all retired or passed on, and all the fun we used to have in the squadron, and it just brought back memories of nice times and nice people, and times that I relish.
And I took a photo of you sitting in an easy chair with a bottle of cold water, and I remember the airplane was parked right in front of the hangar, and you were staring at it, and it seemed like you were a million miles away.
I was a million miles and 60 years away. I got a call from you, Steve, about 2 months ago, maybe 3, and you mentioned to me that my airplane was no longer in California, but it was in Florida. And the owner, the new owner, wanted to paint it in its original colors from VF-44, and with my number 412 on it, and the squadron designations, the F on the tail and the yellow wingtips and rudder, top rudder, and that's great. They're going to put your name on the airplane, and I was ecstatic. I understand that it was in the Bob Black Sheep series. It was in the Reno Air Races, and it's just like a brand new airplane. When I got in it, a lot of nostalgia. Some of the instruments I didn't recognize because when I flew it, it was pretty basic, but the airplane smelled just the same. So I certainly appreciate the past owner and the present owners taking care of my airplane.
We have our three pilot presenters here, and Mark is going to be our expert today on the F4UF Corsair behind him. And first of all, Mark, tell us how you got into the Warbirds and when you started.
Okay. So thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule. This is about my 20th time at Oshkosh, so it's an honor to be here. And I know it's hot, so if it makes you feel any better, people ask us what it's like to fly one of these airplanes. Imagine putting on your winter coat on a day like today, get in your car, and instead of starting it and turning on the air conditioner, you turn the heat on. That's about what it feels like. But anyway, how I got started in this, my father's here in the crowd. I grew up on a 4,000-foot grass strip, started out in the Piper Cub when I was 16, moved up to a Stearman and a T6, a P-51, and then started working for a few museums and got the opportunity to fly 11 different types of Warbirds, and then went on to become an instructor teaching other people to fly the P-51 and the Corsairs. So that's where I got my start.
Tell us a little bit about the specs on the Corsair, please.
Charlie, go ahead. This one's his department.
That's a subtle handoff. And we are greatly honored to be able to present this plane today. And thank you very much to John and Dan Mosley and their crew at John's 360 Coatings, who not only painted this magnificent airplane, but their products help us keep it clean with a little bit of elbow grease. There were over 12,000 of these airplanes built, and I think the great history of this is this wasn't just a World War II plane. This was designed in the early part of the war and wound up finishing through Korea. So of those, you had airplanes built by Chance Vaught in Connecticut, you had Brewster Aircraft and Goodyear, who actually built the most of them. And the number in various models, this is a Dash 4, which is a later model airplane. The difference between the early birdcage one, where people like our great friend Jim Tobel has a chance to fly, to this, it is night and day. It's just the difference is incredible. So we're fortunate to do this. Obie's presentation, for us to be able to fly a plane like this, and thanks to Steve Chappis, our good friend who introduced us to Obie, and to have the honor of flying a combat veteran with the history and still having the pilot today alive, Sam, is just a true pleasure, because as you pointed out, most of the Corsairs, the one we fly the most was a racing airplane. And so if you ask somebody the specs of a Corsair, it's sort of happy to tell you which model.
Well, how big an engine does this have on it?
Well, and Sam, so that's one of those things that this was the real difference maker compared to like the Zero that Mark and I get to fly. This was a beast. This is a 2,000 horsepower engine built by Pratt & Whitney, 2,800. And again, being Northeast guys, we have a little bit of pride because the plane was designed in Connecticut and originally built in Connecticut, but so too was the engine built by Pratt & Whitney up in Hartford and Hartsville propeller. So big engine.
Now, the propeller has a lot to do with the design of the wing, is that correct?
Very much so. So they had such a big engine with so much horsepower, the only way you can convert that engine power to thrust was this giant 13-plus inch or foot propeller. And to land it on a carrier, to have this clearance with this big prop, the landing gear would have to be massive, and of course it becomes a weak point and a point of potential failure. So some very genius people with slide rules, or forget computers and all that, figured out, if we just bend the wings, the gear can be shorter and stouter and take the punishment that you see with carrier landings. That's why we have the gull wing.
And one of the things about the armament, not a lot of people have been able to fly a Corsair with all the rockets and the drop tanks on it. And so a little quick story, when I went to pick up this airplane, Charlie went with me, and it came with all the rockets, the drop tank, but they were all in a corner, and we were deciding, okay, how are we going to get these moved? And we were going to box them all up, but then we got thinking, okay, this is going to be a pretty big box, so let's just hang it all back on the airplane the way it's supposed to be, and we'll take it with us. Well, we had no idea how much drag and weight that adds to the airplane. So I couldn't imagine, we fly it clean today and light. I couldn't imagine taking off on an aircraft carrier with full drop tanks, full rockets, full of fuel, and full of ammunition. It really had to probably be a big struggle, because it's such a dynamic difference. It probably slows the airplane down 30 knots with all that drag.
Tell us, the mission it could be either air to ground or escort. It could be a number of missions, but a typical mission on this airplane flying off the carrier.
It really depends. Are you talking early in the war or later in the war? One of the things that we really enjoy, and it's such a privilege and honor, is to be able to fly both a Japanese Zero as well as the Corsair. And I'll tell you, at some of the air shows down in a confined environment, sort of slow speed, that Zero will eat the Corsair's lunch every single time. It is a kite with a great big engine.
Well, I'm the pilot flying the Zero,
okay,
too,
so when he's
give me a little credit.
It's the Zero is a better airplane. But with that said, as soon as we go somewhere, and we've heard pilots will sometimes play around as they're traveling places, we never do it,
we don't
course.
do that,
No.
of course.
But once you get above 200 knots, that stick in that Zero, it's like it's in concrete.
Yeah.
This plane will start an aerobatic routine at 310, 320 knots. You do that and pull back, and you just finger pressure all day long on the stick. So whether it's slow speed coming into a short grass field or high speed aerobatics, it's a delight to fly.
Well, speaking of the Zero, what's the kill ratio between this airplane and the Zero?
Well, not necessarily the Zero, but the number I know that overall it's about 11 to 1.
That's what I heard also.
It was designed as a Zero killer.
Actually, it killed more. It was 11 to 1 for that. It was 10 to 1 overall. So
overall,
it actually did better
Yep.
on the Zero.
In all fairness, one of the things is we look at the aircraft and how tremendous they are, but a lot of the unsung heroes was the training program that we had going versus what the Japanese and the Germans had. We were producing consistently well-trained, qualified pilots using a lot of the combat veterans coming back to share their experiences. The German and Japanese, you flew until you were wounded beyond ability to fly or dead. And so I think we had that long-term vision that helped us win the war, in addition to fantastic aircraft.
Now, the airplane was designed to operate off the carrier, correct, from the
That's
start.
right, from the start.
Why did the Marines end up with it first and they weren't flying off the carrier?
The Marines will tell you because they were better pilots. I'm not a Marine. I respect them. The reality is, as much as the engineering was genius on the landing gear, there was a rebound, if you will, challenge with the landing gear itself. And so you could get some pretty substantial bounces. So they learned, they improved the gear. The British were operating them off aircraft carriers, and I think there's some new information now saying that Americans were also operating them before we think they were. But the common belief is that the Marines were operating off fixed land bases first. Mm-hmm. It's a sweetheart. It's a big, heavy airplane, but it handles well, slow, and low and dirty. It's the perfect sort of rough field aircraft.
Speaking of weight, what would they operate this thing in combat weight wise?
Well, it's about 12,500, but I was going to go back to the landing characteristics on this. One of the unique characteristics about this is every once in a while, in a crosswind or whatever, you might have one strut collapse before the other, so the airplane will sit a little crooked even though you're traveling straight ahead. And most pilots, you want to compensate and turn the aircraft, but you can't. You have to just trust that the locked tail wheel is taking you straight down the runway, you might put a little bit of aileron in, and then eventually it'll collapse on you. But that if you try to overcorrect with this aircraft, it'll get away from you on takeoff or on landing.
Well, now you compared the Zero to it. How about other like aircraft, like the 51 or whatever?
So Charlie and I
not against each other, but
yeah,
the flying characteristics.
We fly most of our time as Corsair and Mustang. So we've got a lot of time in both. But as far as characteristics, they both fly pretty similar, except the Corsair is heavier, and the Mustang is obviously faster. So when we're out flying, I got to ask them to slow down because I can't keep up with you.
In the cockpit, I think the comparison is the Corsair is the muscle car of the airplanes.
That's a good comparison.
The Mustang is very refined, the Cadillac. The only thing is when it's hot, like Mark was mentioning earlier, the Corsair, you can open the canopy.
Now, let's just jump over the 51 here for a little bit. How about the specifications on that? Are you the expert? Who's the expert?
I'm not an expert in anything.
He's the expert flying it. No, few people fly it better. The amazing story, and again, this is the American ingenuity and the industry stepping up to produce what we needed at the time. From the time that North American had that contract in hand to a first flying prototype was 102 days. You would never see that now. Airplanes are a little more complicated. But it was the North American team went back, and even in Washington, the night that they had those specs in hands, they went in and came up with the preliminary design, and then 102 days later, they had a flying prototype.
Now, the British got the airplane first, right, with the Allison
That's
engine?
correct. Yep.
Well, tell about the conversion for the Allison to the Rolls-Royce.
The Allison down low was fine, but in Europe, the battle and Pacific, the battles were up high. So you needed a good turbocharged engine that operated 30, 40,000 feet. And it was the British who married the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine with this airframe and produced probably one of the best aircraft of the war, if not the best all-around combat fighter.
And then Packard, they started building the Merlin engines
That's right.
for ours.
So it was licensed, built to Packard. So all of the engines that you see these days were actually American-built.
I think one of the remarkable things about this thing is what a kill ratio it had, and it didn't even enter the war until 1944. Late 43 or 44.
I think that's the training, but as Mark knows from flying it so much, you take a lower time, and he trained me, so I blame him for my landings. But you can take somebody who's a lower time pilot, and relative to these two guys, I'm a civilian trained low time guy who flies a desk for a living and not airliners. It was a plane that with a few hundred hours in T6s, you could translate, and I mean you see guys training in it all the time.
Yeah, I've done 22 checkouts for guys in the Mustang, and 2 of them are right here today. But it's one of those airplanes that if you could fly the T6 well, the transition to the Mustang is truly just a transition. I'm not actually teaching somebody to fly the airplane. It's just coaching them, is what I call it, into the...
But in all fairness, now these planes that we fly, whether it's Zach in the 86 or either of these planes, they were designed for combat. This wasn't for the Sunday driver that you give a whole lot of buffet in case somebody messes up. You get to the point where this plane, more so the Mustang, but you stall that thing and it'll just bite you hard. So, that's where accidents happen. And we do hear with all that power with both airplanes, a lot of people say, well, gee, you push that throttle forward and doesn't it torque roll? If you're insane, yes, but nobody's trained to do that. I will tell you, my first flight in the Corsair was out of Mark's personal airport, beautiful grass strip in upstate New York that has a little bit of a hill that I call Mount Everest. He calls it a hill. And I've never really hesitated after good training to fly an airplane. You can't see anything over that nose. The airport sort of pinches in with big, tall trees on either side. And I hesitated. I said, what am I doing here? Yeah. And one of the few planes where he finally said, you know what, just push it forward and we'll make it happen. And that was my first Corsair flight.
Well, what do you guys, give me the typical armament this would have in the escort as an escort? Of course, it's a different. It'd be completely
right.
different than air-to-ground work.
It was an effective air-to-ground, but it had the weakness of a water-cooled or a
radiator.
And one lucky shot and your day is ruined. A plane like this, you could take out a cylinder, and there's all kinds of stories that they would still make it back to the carrier. A typical combat mission, and I'll tell you first now, Mark's only 25. I'm a little bit older than that. You sit in this plane. We were flying up here yesterday from down south, and after 2 hours, you were ready to jump out of the thing if we weren't landing soon. So these young guys who were flying 5, 6, 7 hours to Berlin and back, just incredible. But a typical loadout was drop tanks to have the fuel to make it as far as you could, and then 6 50 caliber machine guns that just a tremendous punch to it.
Well, now they had completely different missions, but I'll put you on the spot. Which do you like best?
For me, it's the Mustang. I've got 1,200 hours in a P-51. It's home for me. I just love flying it.
Most people that flew 51 don't say that.
It is. I get to fly a lot of different ones.
I love that Corsair. That
he loves the Corsair.
Such a beast. You can open the canopy. Yeah. The only thing is, I get older, climbing up and down in that cockpit and that dripping radial engine. And the Mustang, I'll grant it, is a little more.
And we have both fallen off the wing before, which
that's
you're
not supposed to
I
tell
know.
that
It's,
story.
How about the
slippery.
difference in the A, B, C, and D on the 51?
So I've flown the B and the C and the D. I've not flown the A model, but pretty much the same. Stall characteristics are different on the B and the C. That's the I've done some training in them, and I've had twice where the student actually pulled a little too hard on the top of a loop, and the airplane unhooked, and we did a half of a snap roll on the top of a loop, which that'll get your attention in any airplane, especially a P-51.
And the earlier the visibility. Talk about
The
landing.
visibility was not as good as it is with the bubble canopy. It had the canopy with the side door that would latch, and one time we had that unlatch during flight, which again that kind of stuff gets your attention, where the new bubble canopy, you just roll it forward, and great visibility, great flying airplane.
Zach, let's talk a little bit about this F-86, everybody's favorite airplane. Tell us
It is my favorite airplane.
Well, it is a lot of people. The 51 and the 86. But tell us about the airplane, a little bit of specs on it, range on it, thrust, whatever.
Well, the book says it'll go about 1,000 miles when it has the big drop tanks. We got the small drop tanks on here, the 120-gallon drop tanks. With the 200-gallon drop tanks, it's supposed to go about 1,000. We just got this out of restoration about 60 days ago, so we're taking baby steps up to really find out what the range of the aircraft would be. We've flown it 400, 450 at lower altitudes and are working our way up. So armament's got 650 cals, which we've restored. Obviously, they're mock-up guns, but we actually got the feeds and all that stuff.
Why not real stuff?
That ATF,
Well, you're in Florida. So I understand there was 9,800 built. How many do you think are still flying about?
I think the last time I looked, there was 8, and about half those aren't in a position to fly right now. So I think there's 4 in the United States 4 or 5 that are flyable today.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. How about it? Did it serve its mission well?
The F-86, yes, it did a really good job. I mean, Korea is where it really showed itself. And I want to talk a little bit about the paint job. And
well, we get
get there in a second.
That's number 6.
All right, jumped ahead. Okay.
All right. Well, tell us about it was called the last true dogfighter and what the kill ratio was.
Yeah, the Korean War, I don't remember the kill ratio exactly.
10 to 1.
10 to 1, which is right up there with our other aircraft. And the other question was?
Well, why was it called the last dogfighter, true dogfighter?
No missiles. It has guns, so that's why they call it the last gunfighter.
All right, now let's talk about the paint job and who it's dedicated to.
Okay, it's as we talked about earlier with our foundation, we try to identify a person and the person that flew that aircraft, and then honor that person. George Davis is the person. You'll see his name on the left side of the airplane. He was a Medal of Honor winner and what's called an ace of aces. He was an ace in World War II in the P-51, and he was an ace in the Korean War. by the time that he passed away, he had 21 kills or 21 victories total. And at that time, when he passed away, he was one of the most famous aces of all time during the Korean War. And is actually, if you look up his history, it shows that the Russians, Chinese, and the Koreans were actually gunning for him because of all the publicity he was getting. At that time, we generally the rule was if you became an ace in the Korean War, you were immediately retired and sent back home because now you're a war hero. Well, they didn't want to bring him back because his style and his kill ratio was so high. The story that really impressed us with George Davis was he was engaged in a fight with 15 MiG-15s over Korea. He had got 2 bombers, 1 fighter, and he was returning to base, and one of his buddies was engaged with 2 MiGs on his tail and was getting shot up. He turned, re-engaged, shot one of the MiGs, disengaged the other while 24 MiGs were in pursuit, and he made it back to base, landing on fumes. The citation, the Silver Star citation from that reads 5 gallons on board. And anyone's ever flown a Saberjet, you don't want to be at 5 gallons, trust me. So we really like that. So the day he became of Ace of Aces, he was flying misbehaving. So this aircraft, I have to write it down because I can't memorize it. It's a 34th Fighter Squadron, 4th Fighter Wing in the 5th Air Force, misbehaving. This was the we painted this aircraft in honor and matched his paint scheme on that day. So. Okay,
let's talk a little bit about the aces. We had 40 aces in Vietnam. I mean, in Korea.
Right.
And 39 of them were in this airplane.
Correct.
I like airplane. Had 1 in the Corsair. And this is just a little bit of information. It was a Navy night fighter. His name was Guy de Bordelon, and he shot down 5 airplanes with that. Okay, thanks, guys. We're going to have a little question and answer here. Just if I can get somebody with the mics out here.
Was the Sabre ever used as a ground pounder?
You mean as air to ground? Yes, it could carry 1,000-pound bombs on the outboard wing, up to 1,000-pound bombs. They would use it, but it was mainly an air superiority type fighter.
Well, nothing further. We want to thank you folks. Please show up again at 1 o'clock. We're going to have a good show there. The show at 1 o'clock is about the Navy airplanes that were lost in Lake Michigan. And the guy that recovered it is going to give us a little talk to us and tell us about it. So please show up. Thank you.
The last and possibly the greatest propeller-driven fighter aircraft was the Volt F-4U Corsair 1. With their bent wings, the Corsairs are instantly recognizable, but the full extent of their capability is generally not as well recognized as that of other more famous types. However, the F-4U would not only outfight the best of the Axis fighters, but also those on the Allied side. They were powerful, fast, well-armed, strong, and reliable. Ideal fighters. At the end of the war, orders for most aircraft types were cancelled, but the F-4U remained at the heart of the busy development and production program. For those who like to argue the relative merits of World War II fighters, this continued development indicates the high regard in which it was held by the U.S. Navy and Marine. The Corsair not only continued in production and use into the jet age, but in Korea they encountered jet fighters in combat, and the outcome was not always to the jet's liking. The F-4U's peculiar wing reflects the nature of the team that designed it. Thought engineers have often resorted to the unconventional where it worked, perhaps reflecting the age of the country. Founded in June of 1917. Back in those days, intuition was as reliable as science in aircraft design, and Vought has never been in the habit of dismissing the unusual too hastily. Over the years, the company has made a tremendous contribution to aviation in general, and in particular, to United States naval air. The first aircraft to take off on the deck of the U.S. Navy's original aircraft carrier, the Langley, on October 17, 1922, was a Vought plane, a VE-7. This was only one of a number of such historic events for the country. Earlier, the E-7s had equipped the Navy's first two fighter squadrons. The relationship between the Navy and the company has persevered to the benefit of both. The company's founder was Chance Milton Vought, born in New York on the 26th of February, 1890. His father built sailing ships for a living, but the young man turned away from the sea after completing his mechanical engineering studies, and in 1910 started his association with flying machines. Chance Vought died young in 1930, but by then he had built a thriving enterprise that has survived several moves around the U.S. as well as changes of ownership and management. The company's reputation for outstanding aircraft stretches back to their earliest design, and the F4U was to continue this tradition. The company's first plane was built in a third-floor room of a disused ladies' stocking factory. It was lowered to the street in sections out of the windows and then reassembled so the engine could be tested with the plane tethered to a telephone pole. Despite this unusual birth, it was a very successful design. The plane was the VE-7, VE for Vogue Experimental, and 7 because it was Chance Vaught's 7th design. It was modestly described as a two-seat advanced train, but its reception by Army pilots in February 1918 was so favorable that it was ordered into mass production as a fight. After the war's end, some production of the VE-7 continued, including the first orders for the Navy. Several versions found their way into Navy use. There were twin-seat observation and folk planes and the single-seat fighters. Vaught's next plane, the VE-8, was similar to the VE-7 in many respects. The company drew from the VE-7 in different ways, and the VE-7 family were produced into the 1930s, though not as a thing. Vought continued to work on fighter designs, but to little avail. These aircraft were very impressive and included the company's first all-metal plane. However, they were failures in the marketplace, and Vought was only kept alive by its successful sales of other aircraft, including a succession of observation planes called the Corsairs. This is a name that has become very closely associated with Vought. Through the 20s and even the 30s, the Vought company quietly prospered. It was small and sometimes struggled to meet orders, but it continued to have successful designs under production. These included the Vindicator light bomber and the Kingfisher catapult plane, but a successful fighter design continued to elude them. The V-141 was a spectacular failure. Two test versions under evaluation by the Army and Navy in 1935 had disappeared without a trace. The plane had appallings in recovery, and despite the best efforts of the Vought men, it remained dangerous. Renamed the V-143 after stretching, being given a new tail, it still failed to impress any buyer. Meanwhile, in 1936, the company's chief engineer, Rex Weisig, had commenced work on another fighter for the Navy. The design was completed and submitted in 1938. This would be the firm's 6th fighter submission, and the first one to be successful. Within the company it was referred to as the V-166, but it was accepted for testing as the XF-4U. Weisel had devised the smallest practical aircraft around a Pratt & Whitney project for a gigantic supercharged double WASP radial engine that would deliver 1,800 horsepower. At the time, this was the world's most powerful engine.
Generally, it takes about 4 years to develop an aircraft engine from the time you start the design to the time it goes into production. So it was 2.5 years before we flew the engine in the Corsair. We flew an experimental engine, which then had a rating somewhere around 1,600 or 1,700 horsepower. Our experience with the engine in the early flying was quite good. We couldn't get the airplane to altitude because the fuel system vaporized at the higher altitude, but we were able to fly effectively at sea level and up to 20,000 feet or so. The early airplane did so well, in fact, that after a rather limited number of flights, it was flown over a speed course, and it made a speed of 405 miles an hour. This was the fastest that any military airplane had flown up to this time, and that made quite a big impression. This particular flight had an effect far beyond the Corsair program, as a matter of fact, because in the late 1930s, there was a technical debate in the aircraft industry of whether future engines should be air-cooled or liquid-cooled. The air-cooled engines were lighter and simpler and less vulnerable to battle damage. But the liquid-cooled engines were supposed to have a lower drag. So the military were leaning very much in the direction of liquid-cooled engines. Finally, in late 1937, just after the R-2800 was started, they came to Pratt & Whitney and said, this is the Army Air Corps, not the Navy. Army Air Corps came to Pratt & Whitney and said, we're not going to buy any more air-cooled engines from you. Well, that was a tremendous blow, and it was a blow to the R-2800 program at that time. Pratt & Whitney regrouped and started the design of a very large, complicated liquid-cooled engine, which they had no real interest in. Well, they continued the R-2800, but on a lower rate than they should have, until this Corsair flight. And then they invited Hap Arnold, who was, at that time, the chief of the Army Air Corps, in, told him about the Corsair flight, showed him the R-2800 engine, and he says, forget the liquid-cooled engines, and then drive on. So actually, the 2800 powered 3 of our fighters in the war. It powered the Corsair and the Hellcat and the Thunderbolt, whereas the liquid-cooled engines, the Rolls-Royce engine powered the P-51, and the Allison engine powered the Lockheed Lightning. One of the interesting and novel features of the power plant system on the Corsair was the combat power system. Normally, an air-cooled engine is limited really by cooling rather than by mechanical strength. It's usually possible to make something a little stronger, but the cooling is a definite limitation. So at high power, these engines were actually cooled partially by air and partially by fuel. The engine was enriched so that some of the fuel wasn't actually burned effectively. It just went through the engine to cool it. Several years before the war, a couple of engineers at Pratt & Whitney had patented a water injection system to get more power out of the engine by cooling the cylinder with water. Nothing was done about it at the time because the water and fuel consumption was so high that it really wasn't practical to use it for more than 5 minutes or so. However, during the war, it was proposed that this would be all right because combat pilots, 5 minutes would mean an awful lot to them. So Pratt & Whitney developed this combat power system. And what it consisted of was a system with a pump and a tank which added water to the cylinder. When the pilot advanced the throttle beyond a certain gate, it also leaned out the mixture and permitted the engine to be operated at a higher manifold pressure. My good friend and test pilot Boone Guyton did the early flying on this. Very dangerous and challenging work because the engine was operated right up to the limits. All of us who stayed on the ground owed a tremendous debt to Boone and his men because we were completely dependent on them to get the information in flight that we needed to make the engine work. Well, he took the thing up there, and we had a very major engine failure, which resulted in some big problems for Boone. Fortunately, he got through it all right. That particular system gave over 20% increase in power, and the combat pilots loved it. Boone and his group there risked their neck every day to make this airplane a success, and all of us owe them a lot.
It would be over 4 years after the first test order before the first production plane was delivered. Those 4 years, Europe had slid into a war. On the 1st of October 1940, the original X-plane became the first U.S. fighter to fly at over 400 miles per hour in level flight. This not only justified faith in the radial engine, but it confirmed for the Navy that this was the plane needed to fill the role of carrier fighter. The Vought Company was affiliated with the Corsair under the umbrella of the United Aircraft Corporation. The Corsair's power plant was a twin-row 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engine with an initial bore of 5 3/4 inches and stroke of 6 inches. By the end of the war, Pratt & Whitney engines were being produced at over 30 plants in the USA. 26 of these were within the company's control, and 6 other companies were producing the engines on a nominal wartime license fee. The F-4U was designed to be a brutally effective fighter, but it was not an easy airplane to land, a point of concern that led to delays in its full acceptance into service. The F-4U was designed from the outset as a carrier fighter, and as a result, much consideration had gone into making its landing gear as strong as possible. A huge propeller demanded a lot of ground clearance. This would have meant a very high landing gear. The inverted gull wings were specifically designed to compensate. An unconventional wing was no obstacle to the Vought team. A fighter needed as much power as possible, and if this could be best delivered with a strange wing, then so be it. The cockpit was pushed a long way back down the fuselage, and visibility in landing was restricted. The landing gear would be taking stresses above the norm, and the pilots would be concentrating more than was necessary with other types. Despite impressively successful trials, the Navy was reluctant to commit its carriers to the Corsair's protection. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, much more conventionally, was preferred. Though designed as a carrier plane, first U.S. Corsairs were restricted to land-based service with the Marine. The airstrip on Guadalcanal, renamed Henderson Field, was completed and turned into a major asset in the continuing fighting in the Solomon Islands. Steel matting stabilized the surface and made operations safe. Green settled him to a long occupation. When the Japanese gave up their attempts to evict the Marines from Guadalcanal in January 1943, they had already suffered severe losses. However, Japan continued to deploy strong forces. At that time, they still had planes that outclassed their American opponents. Soon, the first Corsairs arrived in the theater to play their part. The Marines were well aware of the reservations about the Corsair, and initially approached their new planes with caution. This evaporated quickly, as the experience of flying the F-4U convinced the pilots that the machines were not. Marine pilots were soon proudly asserting that they were flying the best fighter in the world. Eventually, their voices would be heard. On the 12th of February 1943, Corsair's combat career opened with the arrival of a squadron at Henderson Field. But next day, they escorted bombers to Bogan, a mission that had previously been out of the question because of the short range of the available fighter. Typical of the wartime Marine bases, conditions at Henderson remained fairly limited, with most servicing being carried out in the open or in tents. The Corsairs were maintained and armed, refueled, and turned around fast. As both shield and aggressive forces, they had to be constantly available. The first squadron on Guadalcanal, VMF 124, established the Corsair as a success. In their tour of duty, they shot down 68 Japanese primes against losses of 11 Corsairs and 3 pilots. The squadron provided the first F-4U ace, Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, who downed his 5th plane on the 13th of May. Walsh went on to have 21 combat victories confirmed. The Corsairs were now being produced in large numbers, and the enthusiastic Marines welcomed them. The F-4Us played very little part in the European theater. In contrast to the fragility of the Japanese planes, the F-4U was built taut. The huge engine provided power to handle the weight of the arm. In the hands of the Marines, the Corsairs built up a formidable reputation in air-to-air combat. The Japanese recognized the significance of the Corsairs aright. They had lost the superiority they had enjoyed with the Zero, and they would have little chance to reclaim it. Victory rolls and swoops above Corsair bases were frequent, as pilots celebrated their successes. 9,441 F-4U-1s were produced. This number included several subtypes and numerous modifications. Altogether, 500 major engineering changes and over 2,500 minor alterations were made during the production of the F-4U-1s. Corsairs were to be used by several countries during the war. In particular, well over 2,000 were obtained by the British for use with their fleet air arm. In contrast to the U.S. Navy, the English were quick to seize upon the potency of the plane. Whether it had ideal landing characteristics was secondary to its demonstrable power. Accordingly, they deployed the Corsair to their carriers. The British enthusiasm was to have a strongly persuasive effect when the U.S. Navy came to reconsider the Corsair for its carriers. The British had been pioneers in carrier aviation and had been very influential in its development. British experimentation and theorizing had led the way. Their opinions were treated with respect. In spite of their stained reputation, the British were often highly adventurous. Reducing the concept of a floating runway with the bare minimum is indicative of this. They were soon flying them as many as ordinary, after cutting 8 inches off the wings to make them fit below decks. The British did not have an easy time of it at first. The pilot seat was too low, and this, combined with being so far back, meant that the pilot had very poor visibility. In addition, the undercarriage had too much bounce. These were the very factors that influenced the U.S. Navy to reject the plane for carrying. The British persisted in carrier trial. Later modifications to raise the pilot seat and stiffen the landing gear further reduced the risk line. In April 1944, reacting to the British experience and the enthusiasm of Marine pilots, the U.S. Navy began a new series of Corsair trials. The success of these trials eventually worked to reverse the earlier decision. The F-4U was cleared for carrier service. These were Marine pilots with Corsair experience who had been redeployed to fly from the USS Essex. The Corsairs were simply the most formidable fighter aircraft available, and the Navy had great need for them. The fury of kamikaze attacks that had started in the Philippines would continue to the end of the war, and the Corsairs, as interceptors, were the best available forward defenders.
The first time I saw the XF-4U-1, the predecessor of the production Corsair, was in the mock-up stage. It sat down behind some curtains in the experimental hangar, and I was fascinated. I'd just come out of the Navy, and we had been flying much slower and smaller aircraft. This airplane was tremendous in size. The cockpit was large, and it was unique by those very graceful gull wings, inverted gull wings, if you will, and by the smoothness of the fuselage. I thought it was a tremendous airplane, and I had an immediate desire to want to fly it. I guess any pilot would. I was awareness of my luck in flying the Corsair on the first takeoff of the airplane. I started flying it about the 9th flight after Lyman Bullard made the early flights, got the engine squared away, and the whole flight produced a mixture of awe and just an awareness of what a tremendous design the engineering team at Vought had produced. It was a magnificent airplane, and I immediately simply fell in love with it, literally. And I wanted to continue flying this airplane. It was not just incomparable to any speed or climbing ability or firepower airplane that I had ever seen in the fleet. It had many, because of its unique wing structure and largeness and long nose, it had many sobriquets. I call it Baby. The other nicknames it had were immediate, and they were forthcoming okay. One, of course, was Old Bent Wings, and that was because it had those inverted gull wings. For instance, the Marines, during the Western Pacific operation, in the latter days, were using the airplane almost exclusively as a dive bomber and a close air support airplane, as well as a fighter and interceptor of Zeros and kamikazes. They called it the Sweetheart of Okinawa. Then, of course, the last one was what I named the book that I just completed on the airplane, Whistling Death. Whistling Death came from the Japanese because the airplane made an extremely high whistling scream sound as it came over, as it passed over. And you could always tell it. It was a signature. The airplane had begun already to down Japanese Zeros at a high rate. And so its fame was known along with this sound, and the Japanese decided they'd call it Whistling Death. And that's why the name of the book. Vaught's design team, a great group, came up with innovations to match the advanced power and speed of this airplane. It was a giant step. It was pushing the state of the art, if you will. We started out with an experimental R2800 engine, a double wasp. This went on to the production engine, and we carried the whole power plant system along with the new airplane. So we were pushing the state of the art, and the advanced concepts that had to come along required innovations and a look into the future and a try. We don't gain much by staying with the true and the tried if we're going to advance. So Vought did this. One of the problems with our airplane was, in its early stages, was in establishing the power plant system, which was new, with the airplane as a good integral part and a working operation that a fellow named Don Jordan started to take on as a task. I met Don early on and began to learn about power plants. The engine, this large double wasp, and its high performance required infinite amounts of tests. And nearly every time it got to be almost laughable, but nearly every time I went up, old Don Jordan wanted some type of test. We could perform them on the way and doing stall tests or other things, and it wasn't really that great a chore. But I became very friendly with this person who was extremely knowledgeable about engines. I learned from him so much in the course of these discussions, and he was always pleasant to deal with, that I had no problem in understanding what I was supposed to do with the airplane. If the engine went sour, it wasn't Don Jordan's fault. It was because we were pushing it right to the edge of the envelope.
When the Athlor-Yuns entered Farrier service in the lead-up to the Okinawa invasion, their primary mission was the protection of the Allied task forces from the growing menace of kamikaze attacks. Kamikazes confirmed the fears of the U.S. about Vietnamese fanaticism. Japanese soldiers have stopped their American opponents, been fighting to the last man. Japanese sailors had spun away from ships trying to rescue them in shark-infested waters. Now, from the death throes of the embryo, young men were flying their aircraft as guided bombs to crash into Allied ships. Despite their muscle, the kamikaze attacks didn't dwarf that. Even as 90% of an attacking force were shot down, a remaining 10% was still potentially lethal. The only ships relatively impervious to the raids were the battleships and some of the British carriers on their decks. The Corsairs' arrival on the carriers coincided with a crescendo of kamikaze missions. Around Okinawa, the Japanese defiantly threw in massed raids as well as the normal smaller. 10 massed attacks totaled some 1,500 sorties out of a total of around 3,000 attacks in 3 months. Over 400 ships were hit. This works out at around 1 strike for every 8 aircraft lost. If the Japanese had not run out of aircraft first, they would eventually have run out of volunteers. Despite the success of the Corsairs in intercepting the incoming attacks, the kamikazes still got through in significant numbers. With F-4Us now flying from all carrier task groups, some Corsairs also burned in the kamikaze frames. The best place for a burning plane is somewhere astern, underwater. Damage and fire control became the finely honed skills of professionals in the course of the war.
The first time that I flew the Corsair was on the island of Espiritu Santo. Major Bill Geist came in with the first Corsair outfit into the Solomon Islands. And I just couldn't wait to get into this airplane because I'd heard all the great things about it. And I have to tell you this, that it was like stepping from Model T into a Cadillac. I'd been flying the Grumman F4F Wildcat. In fact, all my aerial combat was in that airplane. And then to get into this airplane was a great change. And while I was up working it out, it was a birdcage model. It had the oddball canopy, so to speak. The aerial came off, and the stick that stuck up there for the aerial, that's all the damage I did to it. And I came in, made a perfect landing with the thing, and that was with the short shank on the tail wheel, which gave a lot of pilots a lot of trouble later because it had a tendency to want to ground loop on some of the old boys. So that tail wheel shank was extended and made it a lot easier to land. The thing I liked about the airplane was, of course, the comfort of the cockpit and the fact that it went faster, was a lot quieter than the plane that I had been flying. I just loved this airplane. It was just a great airplane to dive bomb with, easy to get on the target and stay on the target with. And all I could say about it was an outstanding performer. I remember back with the old biplane, the old F4B4, the old Boeing. That was my first fighter, of course, and I can remember guys, just, oh, that's a ground looping SOB, ground looping my foot. That thing just, if you knew how to handle it, you right down that runway straight, you had no problem with the thing. On our new lieutenants that were coming in there at Goleta, we just gave them the manual and went over the thing step by step and did give them systematic checkout. And we didn't have any problems at all there with ground looping or any other problem on getting the plane off and on. See, the reason that the shank was, maybe I'm using the wrong term, on the tail was lengthened on the tail wheel was so that the plane came up and didn't, these wings that have the bend didn't blank out the tail, so that you would come in and make more of a flat landing in place of this. And it did make a big difference for somebody just checking out in it. It took away the tendency to wander at one point as the tail dropped. And so all I can say is that it was not a difficult airplane to fly. It was a great airplane from start to finish. The firepower happened to be the 650 calibers. And of course, that's, to me, is the greatest gun that was ever built. They worked great, and when you hit something, they ended the career of that plane or ground target, whatever it was. It was vicious. And you've heard a lot of wild stories where it sort of stopped the airplane. Well, that's a crock. The airplane just moved right on through. You never had any problem at all when you were firing the 650s.
The end of the war coincided with a critical moment in the history of aviation. With the arrival of the jet, propeller-driven aircraft was suddenly aerodynamically inefficient. The U.S. didn't want the Royal Navy Lend-Lease Corsairs, and the British didn't want to pay for them. To satisfy the letter of the law, it was agreed that the British pushed them over the side. Navy and Marines chose the Corsair as the plane they wanted to keep on. And it was not just a question of the wartime aircraft. New models would be developed and produced. The F-4U was still being produced and backflying combat missions in America's next war. The constant close intervention of the Corsairs, operating from the carriers and from within the encirclement at Busan, was an important factor in that war. With the other World War II types, like the Mustangs and Invaders, the F-4Us could carry large loads and loiter for hours. They could deliver accurate close support and tie up road and rail links. As had so often been the case during World War II, the carriers played a major part in asserting control of the skies over Korea. This was ultimately decisive. China's massive reserves could not realistically be risked under the fierce umbrella of American air superiority. From its earliest manifestations as a fighter aircraft, the Corsair had grown remarkably diverse. The Marines had turned it into a dive bomber and rocket platform. The closely coordinated activities of the Marines in Korea also serve to illustrate the outstanding virtues of the Corsair. Big workhorses handled the unsophisticated strips and their buckling matting without complaint. But the severity of the winter caused many problems. There were periods of the war when all aerial activity was suspended. The planes were frozen. By the same token, even the Chinese could not make very much progress in conditions like these. The demand for the Corsair services was such that during the war, many of the planes were recalled from reserve units for use in combat. Their virtues in the close support role were unmatched. The Navy needed them in the front line. Perhaps there were some regrets about the heap of ex-British Corsairs rusting deep in the Pacific. In August 1952, Captain Jesse G. Fulmer became the first American to shoot down a MiG-15 with a propeller-driven plane. Airstrikes by U.S. Marines and Navy Corsairs continued up to the last day of the conflict, 27th of July, 1953.
We had some unexpected help in flight testing the Corsair, which began in February of 1943. I was sitting in the flight ready room, and I got a call from our senior person, Mr. Paul Baker at this time. And he asked if I'd come over and show Charles Lindbergh around the experimental hangar, discuss our projects with him, and flying the airplane. I was for a moment overcome because this man had been a hero to so many people for so long, and I certainly was one of them. that I had to collect myself, and I finally did. And after lunch, went over and met Lindbergh, and we went down to Experimental, had a discussion about the projects, and went behind the classified curtains. He was about the same size I was, 6'4", so it was easy to talk. We could sort of lean together with all the noise and clamor in the experimental shop of metal being pounded, and we got quite a bit said and done. I learned immediately that in dealing with Lindbergh, you measured your facts carefully, because he was an extremely careful person about what he learned and what he heard. This relationship continued for quite a while, for perhaps another couple of years. One of the noted ways that Lindbergh operated was in great care of whatever he did, such as when he would sit in a cockpit of a Corsair after a test flight, even a production test flight, and spend a half an hour reviewing his thoughts, looking at his flight test card, and thinking about the airplane. And nobody would approach him and touch him. Well, when he left the house in this car he had borrowed, I noticed he went around carefully and checked the tires. When he got in, he looked at the instruments and spent quite a bit of time, maybe 5 minutes, just checking this plain old Pontiac, I think it was. And when he finally left, I figured that I had a pretty good car, Lindbergh wouldn't be driving it.
We were having some difficulties with the Corsair right at that time. A few little problems, like the one was that the engine was cutting out when we were doing altitude gunnery above 20,000 feet. And so I went over to see Colonel Sanderson, said that we need some expert to come up here and help us out a little bit. So he says, well, I'll call General Charlie Wallace and see what we can do. And next thing I knew, he handed me the telephone, and it was the general, and he said, well, what can I do for you, Joe? I had been with him at Guadalcanal, so we knew one another real well. And he said, we'll get you up an expert there right away if you need one. And that's what happened. And the next day, or 2 days later, who showed up but Charles A. Lindbergh? And of course, I'd always been an admirer of his from his flight across the Atlantic, and had looked forward to meeting him. And of course, he said he wanted to go to work right away, and he flew morning, noon, and night, always carried a map in his pocket. He worked on the plane. He found a lot of bugs here and there on these brand new airplanes that we'd just picked up. And he eliminated their problems in a hurry. Not being an engineer, I can't tell you exactly what they were, but the engines functioned perfectly at high altitude. Everything went well. And of course, that was put out all through the Marine Corps in the effort that he put in on that. And then the last thing he said to us after being there a month was, you know, if I had my wish, it would be to fly a tail end Charlie in your outfit. And I said, well, don't worry about that. You ever show up and you want to be flying tail end Charlie. And lo and behold, when we got up to Amaral, who showed up but Charles A. Lindbergh, and he flew every mission during the time that he was there on dive bombing and strafing Caviang, New Ireland, and Rabaul, New Britain, and all of the sneak missions that we did in the area. So his performance in combat was great.
By the end of the war, the Corsair's days were clearly numbered. Production had finally ceased in December 1952. The last Corsairs in fighter and attack squadron service were relegated to reserve units in December 1954. The reserves would fly them until 1957, and the French continued to use them until October 1964. In Korea, jets were new and still developing, whereas props were well established and refined. F-4Us did the desperate defensive work early in the campaign, and the aggressive work of the latter phases equally convincing. The honor of being the last U.S. Navy user of the F-4U went to Squadron VC-4, which flew its last Corsair, a night fighter F-4U-5N, in December 1955. 12,571 Corsairs were produced. 7,830 of these were built by Model. There were 36 major subtypes and thousands of minor variations between batches of planes. Their decline from being the world's finest fighter only saw them become the world's finest ground support aircraft. Both Japanese and American pilots acknowledged the Corsair as the Allies' finest fighter, and also agree they were better than anything the Japanese had. The chance bought Corsair.
One of the Corsair's greatness items, however, was immediately apparent. We had the fastest naval fighter in the world. The first airplane over 400 miles an hour for a time belonged to the Corsair. One of its greatness features was its high speed at all altitudes. The R2800 engine gave us, its two-stage engine, gave us an ability to go to nearly 30,000 feet and still be faster than the Zero or competing aircraft. I like to think of George Axtell's comments in finalizing this greatness item. George thought of the airplane as a complete one. And George Axtell was an ace and a hero in the Okinawa campaign, and later on. He led the Death Rattler Squadron into action, and his comments about it were, "It's the best fighter there is. It's rugged and it's a workhorse. You can use it for anything, including dive bombing, and it's very effective. You can shoot anything off of that airplane, and it still goes." I thought that literally told us what the airplane was all about for combat.
I am George C. Axtell. I'm a retired Lieutenant General, United States Marine Corps. I commanded in World War II the VMF 323, and I commanded 312 in Korea, flying Corsairs off carriers. I first saw the F-4U when I was stationed at the Naval Air Station Anacostia. I noticed the airplane that it was a large single-engine aircraft with a large engine, powerful, the large prop, and it looked so graceful and powerful in the landing pattern as well as on the climb out. I was very impressed with the aircraft. What I liked about the airplane that it had power, it was maneuverable, and I thought relatively easy to fly. The first opportunity I had to fly the airplane in combat was in Okinawa in 1945. We entered at the beginning of the Okinawa campaign.